So the topic of my talk is Rails the next 5 years. I want to start with a short disclaimer, which is the opinions represented in this talk are not the opinions of the Rails core team or my employer. So this is sort of my feeling about this. The logo on the left side is my company's logo, my new company's logo. Work for a company called Tilda. We've been doing a lot of consulting as a bootstrapping mechanism. We don't want to take VC. And as part of the process, we've done a lot of different projects. We've done a lot of JavaScript-heavy projects because we're good at that, and we've done a lot of projects that involve a server-side component. And increasingly, we go into projects and Rails is not a slam dunk. And so some of the projects, there's a guy there who wants to use Node or Clojure or Scala or something. But increasingly, people pull us in, they know we like Rails, and they say, basically, you need to sell us on why we should use Rails in this project. And I think because we have two guys from the core team, and we have the guy who made Bundler and the guys from the Ember core team, when we go and talk to them, usually we're able to convince people that Rails is a good idea. But the fact that we're basically going to projects that theoretically could choose to use Rails or not, and increasingly we're being asked to justify why we should be using Rails or not, to me is a big problem. I like using Rails. I want to use Rails in the future. I don't want Rails to end up being we make human resources applications in HTML. I want us to actually be keeping up with what people are doing. And increasingly, I am getting the sense from being, I think, a little bit on the leading edge because we do mostly rich JavaScript applications, that there's something amiss. Something is wrong with the direction of Rails. So I want to start by talking about, first, the last 5 years. So I've been working on Rails since 2008. I've been working on Rails apps since 2006. And when thinking about what's going amiss, I first have to think like, okay, why do we like Rails in the first place? Because maybe a lot of people say, well, Rails is basically like a transitional technology. Rails was there to help solve HTML-based problems, and then now we're doing JavaScript, so like Node is clearly the answer now. And I wanted to think back, like, okay, why do we like Rails? And I gave a talk at Ruby on Rails on a sort of similar topic, and I said to the audience that Rails is not obsolete because the ideas that underlie Rails are still controversial. And in fact, most other communities, most other libraries, most other frameworks do not actually, they're viscerally against actually what Rails stands for. So I first wanted to think about, okay, what's good about Rails? Why do we like Rails? And most people would say, we like Rails because we have convention over configuration. That's sort of the Rails tagline. That's the Rails nationalism motto, convention over configuration. And I think there's something to it, but I think we've started to repeat it a lot to the point where we don't really understand what it means exactly anymore. So to me, and I think DHH sort of talks about it a lot, is when we say convention over configuration, what we mostly mean is eliminating trivial choices. So if there's choices that exist while everyone's building a web application that everyone's doing maybe the same, maybe a little bit different, but they're fundamentally trivial, like whether you should have Colgate extra whitening or extra whitening Colgate or Colgate extra whitening active plus with mint, right? Like at the end of the day, the web development ends up looking often a lot like this, where you have to make a lot of choices, but the choices don't actually matter at all. But you go into the aisle and you look and you say, I have to think about this. So some trivial choices that you know about, like what you should name things. Now, like, how do we compile assets? Should you test? When you get an HTTP request, how does it get to the router? What are the rules for that? How does it get to your controller? How should you structure your file system? What is the core architecture of the application? And one thing that I want to say is that actually, I think in a lot of communities, if a problem is very common, you end up with a proliferation of choices. So you end up with 100 different libraries that do the same thing. And maybe not in the Rails community, but in Rails itself, we actually believe the opposite. If a problem is very common, you should have to make fewer decisions, not more of them. And basically what Rails does is Rails takes on the responsibility of solving problems that are very common. And what's really awesome about the fact that we do that is that because we take such a hard line on conventions, we end up being forced to solve problems in a much more complete way than people who try to solve the same problems without conventions. It's very hard for us to punt a problem onto a Rails developer, because in a lot of cases, if we punt a small piece of the solution onto the Rails developer, it's the first time the Rails developer ever heard of the problem. So the hard line that we take on conventions ends up being really valuable for the completeness and the robustness of the solution that we need to provide. And I just want to give one small example, which is CSRF protection. So how many people know about CSRF? So everybody, how many people know like how to mitigate CSRF? How many people, given the opportunity to build an app from scratch without a library, would successfully mitigate CSRF in a way that you would feel very reliable and comfortable about? So few people, right? Yeah, so I would, maybe, I hope, I would probably go look at the Rails code if I had to do that. So CSRF protection is basically, because everyone raised their hand, it ends up being this checkbox that every framework has to check off. I solve CSRF protection, but there's actually a lot of different ways that you can solve it. So the way Connect solves it is 100% manual. There's a middleware you insert. You can see here, here's the documentation. You have to decide which verbs it applies to. Does it apply to get, post, put, or delete? Here they tell you in the documentation that it should only apply to post, so hopefully you are not vulnerable to a put or delete CSRF attack. Cross your fingers. And they also tell you to manually go in and gsub out or replace out the contents of your HTML page, which I don't even understand because Node people like streaming, so I don't know how you have the body, but somehow you have the body here, and you're supposed to replace a curly token curly with the CSRF token. So this is clearly 100% manual. The solution exists to give you a CSRF token, but everything else is up to you. So you have to like really think about what's going on. Django is what I call semi-automatic. They give you a thing you could paste into your form, CSRF token, and they give you a jQuery snippet, which is actually wrong. So you have to go to Stack Overflow and find out that it's wrong, and they're using the wrong jQuery event. But they give you a snippet that you can paste into your JavaScript file, and then it will solve the Ajax problem. You can paste in CSRF token. So they basically have given you some tools. They've given you a good library for solving CSRF, but you still have to sort of think about what to do. And you could sort of just follow the rules and copy and paste, but without a good understanding of what's going on, it's very easy to make mistakes. It's a very common question in Stack Overflow and Django is, how do I turn off CSRF protection? I'm getting this weird error. And Rails basically says, okay, whenever you use a form helper, so we're going to make you use a form helper. Whenever you use a form helper, we're going to handle CSRF. We're going to handle Ajax for you transparently. We're going to handle API servers for you transparently. So we actually spent all this time saying, imagine that you are a person who knows nothing about CSRF. How do we give you an application that is CSRF secure? And for me, conventions allow you to avoid thinking about the problem at all when you're working on features. So obviously, it's good to know what CSRF is. But what tools give you is they make the problem easier to solve once you know about it, but it still makes you think about it. And in my mind, the cognitive overhead of solving a problem, most of it is in understanding the problem in the first place. So CSRF is one example, but there are literally hundreds of these types of problems in Rails, a lot of security, a lot of just like things like encodings that when we don't have a convention for something, we end up forcing the end developer to learn about the problem and choose a solution. And again, this is most of the cognitive overhead of doing it in the first place. And so the goal is to get the cognitive overhead to zero. And I think what's important is that there's no intermediate between the zero and the I have a tool to solve it. Once you have to solve with a tool, now you have to understand the problem. And again, there are many. And what's really awesome, another thing that's really awesome about conventions is that common conventions in Rails applications provide a foundation for building other abstractions. So everybody has controllers, so you can have an authorization framework that plugs into controllers. Everyone has active records, so it's easy to write active record plugins. You can write asset pipeline extensions if you want to use handlebars instead of ERB, right? And so when we build conventions and everyone uses them, it makes it a lot easier to talk about things like an asset pipeline compilation step, an asset pipeline extension. So Aaron yesterday talked about 3 different types of features in Rails, and I'm not super interested, I've never been super interested in the cosmetic type of change, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of time anymore for the huge refactoring types of changes that Aaron works on. But what I am very interested in is figuring out, again, why it is that when my company goes to start a new project, we have to go convince people that Rails is a good idea, when 2 years ago that was not the case. 2 years ago, most people, you're in a startup, they said, Rails sounds good, go. And now that's not true anymore. And I want to figure out why that is. So what is the criteria? What is the rules for when we decide that a course correction is a good idea? So the first rule is there's a lot of people who use Rails that have the same problem. So that's sort of a low bar. Now, a good criteria, a useful criteria is there's a lot of parts of this problem that are basically trivial. So in the process of solving this problem, you end up doing a lot of the same things. So REST is a good example of this. What HTTP structure should I use? What name should I give my methods? How do I generate URLs? These are trivial questions, and part of the process of course correcting onto REST eliminated a bunch of trivial decisions that we were making before. So that was a good course correction. There also should be benefit in a shared solution, but like I said before, there's often easy benefits. So the asset pipeline, for example, there's benefit in that it works out of the box. You don't have to think about like how you want to compile your assets and what it means to compile assets. You go into a new Rails project these days, it's probably using the asset pipeline. And we have the concept of a Rails asset preprocessor. You don't have to say, I'll do sprockets or jam it, or I'm going to do my own thing because I don't want to have to tell you which thing to use, right? So now there's the concept of a Rails asset preprocessor. And finally, one criteria that sort of trumps everything is if learning about the problem in the first place is sufficiently hard that asking everyone to do it is not acceptable. So encodings are a good example of this. The win of encodings is that you don't have to know about encodings. The win of IP spoofing and timing attack protection is you don't have to know about IP spoofing and timing attack protection. The win of the fact that we generate e-tags together with every response is you don't have to know about conditional get, HTTP conditional get to get some benefit out of it. So if learning about the problem is hard, that's a very good criteria for us doing a course correction and starting to bring something into Rails. So the flip side of this is, okay, so what does it mean if we fail to solve a problem in Rails core? What does that end up doing? So the first problem is having multiple competing solutions robs any one solution of the critical mass it needs to rapidly improve. No initial implementation of any problem is perfect. Often they're very imperfect. And Rails, when you put something in Rails, it provides eyeballs and hands to get something done. So the asset pipeline wasn't heavily used before. And when we got into Rails, there were obviously a lot of problems. And it has rapidly gotten to the point where it's not painful to use. And that was because it's in Rails. So it existed for many years before. Now it's in Rails. We were able to rapidly improve it. Now it's tempting to say, okay, this feature is important. Let's just make it a plugin. We'll let our users figure out what the feature is. But again, this often results in several competing solutions, each languishing with a few users, all of which have major problems. And lack of usage often results in conceptual problems with an approach. So for example, the asset pipeline, when it was first released, did not deploy onto Heroku. So Heroku had to do a ton of work working with Rails over the course of many months to get the asset pipeline into a state where we deployed onto Heroku. And nobody, I don't think, reported that bug to Sprockets before. Right? So just getting it into Rails meant that we uncovered a conceptual problem with implementation that was not obvious due to the low usage of the feature. Also, when users pick a solution on their own, they are willing to put up with a lot of manual work. So the process of integrating a feature into Rails to automate it often brings up fundamental problems with the amount of work that you have to do to use a certain approach. So again, the asset pipeline is a good example of this. Once we got it in, we were like, okay, we have to do a bunch of work. We have to change how we're thinking about the problem in order to make it more automatic. So simply making it manual doesn't necessarily get the job done. And for me, the biggest problem actually is people who are most likely to choose a plugin solution to a problem also understand the problem, which means that there's very little impetus to provide completely transparent solutions that work without any knowledge of the problem, because there are 0 users of the plugin that don't have any knowledge of the problem. Right? So you end up with this echo chamber of people that are assuming that it's okay to do work that involves knowledge of the problem. And by making something in Rails, it susses out the fact that many people want a solution to the problem without a full and complete understanding of what the problem is in the first place. So Aaron said yesterday, when solving larger issues, we have a higher tolerance for technical debt. I agree with this. That said, we probably shouldn't throw caution to the wind at this point and take on unlimited debt because we're still paying back our last emergency loan. So we have $700 billion of technical debt to pay back. So let's pay that back before we throw caution to the wind and take on another emergency bailout. I know Aaron said that features are too big to fail. There's nobody actually going to bail us out, though. He said that as well. So we actually need to be careful to not take on debt that causes Rails itself to become unsustainable, which I think largely we're doing. Rails 3 and all the work that Aaron's done since Rails 3 have largely been about paying down technical debt. Architecting a feature well, so if we solve these problems and we architect it well, it means that the feature gets improved in the future. And a lot of the things that are good about the Rails 3 architecture, like notifications, have only come to fruition, they've only come to light now, and that doesn't mean that we didn't need to do them in the first place. So thinking about, okay, like what is the best way to solve this problem when we solve it in the first place, basically means that if new requirements come out in the future, it's easier to course correct. The asset pipeline is very hard to course correct right now because the implementation is too, I want to say crufty or coupled. So Aaron, again, had this formula, which is your tolerance for debt is features now plus features later over cost now plus the overall maintenance. And I think a lot of people focus on, when you go look at pull requests, it's like features now over cost now. It's like how much did it cost to implement this feature and what do we get for it? And for me, the other things are the most important. So Josh said in the talk, the future is the most important because it's the thing we're living with for the rest of our life. And for me, that makes the features later and the maintenance later more important than the features now and the cost now. It's often possible to have a low cost and decent features and make it very hard to add features later, and the maintenance costs are astronomical. So when we correct course, we're basically placing a bet about the future of our industry. So DHH, when he decided to use REST, he was essentially betting on the idea that REST and HTTP was the future of web development. And we got some really good wins out of REST. And the wins of REST were basically that even though we were an HTML framework, and most HTML frameworks focus on HTML, we ended up getting really, really good HTTP semantics that have evolved over time and have become really powerful. So we have a great router that knows how to do constraints based on HTTP requests. We know how to do content negotiation. We know how to we have the idea of MIME types that you could extend. We have conditional get and caching. Now we have rack cache. You can send a request body that's JSON, and you get that as parameters. We handle a lot of HTTP security, right? So there's all these wins of the fact that even though we were a HTML framework, we said, okay, we're going to think about what we're doing, not in terms of HTML, but in terms of HTTP. And that basically means that Rails today has a really great foundation for doing other things with HTTP. And those things are our JSON APIs. But there's one problem lurking, which is that we are very good at HTTP, but most of the hard problems of dealing with client-server interaction are actually not about the HTTP layer, which is very agnostic. It's about data transport. And in order to talk about data transport, I first want to talk about SQL databases and how Rails handles SQL databases. So before Rails, there were a lot of decisions that you made when you built a new SQL database. Your DBA would come in and say, okay, what's the primary key? Maybe per table. What's a table name? If we want to use timestamps, what are they called? What's the format? Do we have created at? Do we have updated at? If we want to do polymorphic tables, so tables that support multiple concrete types, how do we do that? That could be arbitrary ad hoc setup. We have foreign keys. How do we figure out what to name those foreign keys? Do we want to use camel case or underscore? All these things are something that was done outside of the app development process and in a DBA team. A DBA would decide and they would give you the answer. And what that basically meant was there were a lot of discrepancies between what your database looked like, and you had to basically build a map. The server team and the client team had to basically build a guidebook for the application that said, okay, here is what the SQL database, how it converts into your local language. And that was basically common. This is how it worked. And when Active Record said, no, actually, this is not how it works. From now on, you're going to do some conventions. You're going to say foreign keys are foo_ID, keys are ID, tables are pluralized, polymorphic associations are type, done. We're just going to tell you what the rules are and you're going to follow them. Maybe you could do some hacks if you want to do something different. But if you're doing Rails, most Rails applications, the vast majority of them are going to follow these rules. People said, they looked at all the databases that existed and said, databases are too different. How are you going to tell a DBA, like, hey, you need to follow these rules? The DBA has reasons for what they're doing. They want to think about what they're doing. They want to craft their database in a way that they want to craft it. And it turned out that those arguments didn't matter, right? Those arguments were trumped by the fact that we could eliminate all this extra mapping code, all this gunk that we had to write in order to use Active Record. And now we're hearing exactly the same arguments with JSON APIs. I want to handcraft my JSON API. I want to think about how it works. I want to make sure that the keys are what I think they should be in this particular situation. And there's, in the same way that DBAs thought that that was a good idea, people who make JSON APIs think it's a good idea too. But in weighing the win of handcrafting everything, people are not weighing the loss of lacking conventions. So JSON APIs have actually very similar types of problems. Should the response include a root? Ember says yes, backbone says no, right? How do you embed associations? Should you include an identifier? In what form should you include an identifier? Is it an ID or an href? How do you include additional resources? How do you include associated resources? How do you update many items together in bulk? You want to update 100 items together. How do you do that? Where does the primary key get defined? Does it get defined in the client as a UUID, or does it get defined on the server? If we define it on the server, how do we make sure that we get those IDs into the foreign keys? How do you move a belongs to record? Do you move a belongs to record by having the parent have an array that gets saved to the server, or do you have a foreign key on the child record? Right? These are all questions that every single person who has to make a JSON API has to think about, maybe in an ad hoc way. Maybe you don't have to solve all these problems. For me, I have to solve all of them. But you have to solve some of these problems, and you have to do it every single time, often without a good understanding of what these questions mean, what the consequences are. And I think the real tragedy is that without a good standardized server solution, we can't have standardized client code. And this is what happened to Active Resource, right? The server was simply not sufficiently standardized for the client to work. So we wanted to have a thing that was active record for JSON APIs, and then we didn't actually do the step where we said you have to follow these rules on the server side. So we ended up with the same crappy mapping layer with terrible tools in Active Resource. So Active Record got away with terrible tools in the beginning because we had these very strong conventions. Active Resource had no conventions and terrible tools, so the end result is nobody can use it for anything. So we can't actually build standardized clients without standardization on the server. And so we're back in the same place where we have to make trivial decisions over and over again on the server and the client. And even if we realize that we're making trivial decisions, Rails is not really stepping in to help us. And because we're not taking on the problem as Rails, we're pushing the problem onto the client. So now what we end up seeing is people say, Rails is about convention over configuration, and Rails doesn't provide conventions for this problem. So is Rails actually the right tool for the job? So even though Node or Sinatra doesn't provide any conventions, the fact that Rails is about convention over configuration means that it feels weird that there's no convention for this. It feels like, what's the win of Rails if I have to do all this work myself? I may as well, if I have to hand roll it, I'll hand roll it somewhere else. And people don't think about the wins of Rails. Because Rails basically, when you're building a JSON API, starts feeling like a very polished, very powerful library and less like a framework. And I think that's why people start asking, if I'm going to use a library anyway, why would I not use a smaller library? So that's sort of the entry point into what I've been working on for the past maybe year now, together with Jose, which is to solve one of the parts of this problem. And that's to basically say, how do we make it so that there's an easy declarative way to have JSON that looks the same for everybody? And in order to understand that, you need to think about serialization in terms of two different pieces. There's what you should serialize, and that's like, what attributes do you want to include from this model? What associations do you want to include? And then there's a whole bunch of other questions, which is like, how do you serialize it? Do you include a root? Do you include associations? How? What are extra data? All the things I talked about before. And that's a different question. That's not the same question as what you want to serialize. It's how you should serialize it. And the right side is all the types of things that Rails is usually good at doing for us. So an active model, serializers, you basically inherit from your serializer, and you just say what to serialize. You say, here are my attributes. Here's what I belong to. Here's my has many. And for authorization right now, you basically you say, OK, I want comments. But what are the comments? You say, my comments are all the comments if I'm an admin, and if I'm not an admin, it's where hidden is false. But note that even though we're doing some work here to say what the comments are, there's no code here that says whether you should have a root. There's no code that says how your association should be shipped. And there's basically the application serializer is where the strategy for how you should serialize it goes. And again, for Ember, this is basically the default. I'm probably just going to make this the default. And basically, in my opinion, the right answer and the correct conventional answer is instead of embedding objects directly, you should embed IDs. And the reason for that is that it's very common to have a JSON object with the same information repeatedly. So if you have to type in the same, if you put in the same information repeatedly, obviously it's bigger. But more importantly, when the client sees person 1, if they see it in 3 different places, which one is canonical? I hope it's not different. How do you actually go through that and make sure it's the same object? So in my opinion, the correct answer is to flatten out the structure and say, here's my IDs, and you basically provide the whole answer. So last year I gave a talk that was sort of similar to this, and I said, I'm just throwing out some ideas here. Everybody should have a discussion, let's figure it out. And actually, I've changed my mind. So we tried to have a discussion for the entire last year, and I think what we should learn from Rails is that any convention is better than no convention. We don't need to have a massive bike shedding discussion about this. We should just get something in. We should have Rails have an answer for it, and then we could tune it over time like we do with everything else in Rails. I think the bike shedding discussion is exactly the sort of thing that causes problems to not get solved in other frameworks. So let's not do that. We should obviously have a discussion about it, but it should not take another year. So I want to show you a demo of using active model serializers. And the goal of active model serializers was to make it really seamless together with Rails. So I want to show that. I don't know if you can see this. I'll narrate. So first you build a new Rails application. I'm calling it serials here. Bundle went really fast. You go into serials. You add the active model serializers gem and faker. You run bundle. You make a new directory for serializers. This is still something that is not automatic but will be. You make a new application serializer. You go into your application serializer. You say class application serializer inherits from active model serializer. Then you generate a couple of resources, and the thing to notice about these resources is that it's automatically generating a serializer together with the resources. So we're getting serializers for free. And so we generate user, post, and comment with the appropriate associations. We go in, obviously, we need to put in our has many association like in any other Rails application. So has many comments in our posts. And we also go into the serializers and remove a has one post from the comments because otherwise you would end up with a circular association. So now we go and we run our RakeDB migrate. I have some faker data there that it's going to spit out some basic stuff. And we run RakeDB setup, which is going to run the faker data. So now we have our stuff. And now we basically go into our post controller and we say, we make our normal post controller. So render JSON, post.scoped, and our show action is render JSON, post.find params ID. And active model serializers basically just hooks into the normal JSON serialization process. So instead of calling toJSON, it allows your serializers to decide how things get serialized. We start a new server. We curl HTTP localhost 3000 /post/1. Wait a bit. We get our post back. Post 2, post 3, right? We get the right stuff. And then we can also ask for the whole thing. This is a cool feature that you might not know about comes with JSON. You can say prettify JSON, and it will basically dump out the JSON in pretty form. And what you can see here is that the posts already exist, and they include our title and body and our embedded user. So now we're going to go into our post serializer, and we're going to add has many comments. And again, we didn't have to say how we should include the comments. That's basically just a default. And the comments, basically, if you go up, are just included as embedded objects here. But like I said before, I like embedding IDs instead of objects. So I'm going to go change it to embed IDs include true. And without changing anything about what we want to serialize, we were able to modify how it should be serialized with one line. And then we can decide, OK, we don't want to include true. We want to lazy load all those associations. And now we just have the comments included as IDs, and we can lazy load them later. And we can also go in and we can modify this on a per serializer basis. Hey, I want to embed the objects for some reason here. We'll see that this serializer got embedded. And we can also change the rules on a per association basis. So you can say this association should be included. So why does this matter? The advantage of serializers is that it decouples, it avoids mixing common things, which is the representation, how a JSON object should look, with the things that are unique for your application, which is what I want to show in the first place. And this is in contrast with a builder approach, which puts the common things and the unique things together in one place. So if we want to change what JSON looks like, you have to go in and go modify all of your builders. If you change your mind about something, you have to modify all of your builders, and you end up having to think about it every single time you build, okay, I want to include IDs. How do I include IDs? This is to me, very not Rails. Rails says, we're gonna make some rules for you. You're gonna follow them, and the right thing is gonna happen. And when you use a builder, you're basically being asked to handcraft things again, which is the opposite of how Rails wants to work. As with anything, conventional overconfiguration doesn't mean no configuration, and authorization is by far the most common thing. So there's actually a pretty good abstraction ladder in active model serializer. So you can override include associations bang, and you say like, okay, here's all my comments. Here's like a simple like can API. If you can't see hidden, restrict the comments to being hidden. Include bang the comments, which basically just says, do whatever you normally do. So again, it's decoupling I want to include the comments from what it means to include comments. And then include troll ratings only if the scope can troll rate. So scope is basically just the current user. So if the current user can troll rate a post, then include troll ratings. And again, include bang is basically what you should do, not how you should do it. How you should do it is somewhere else. So we've kept the API very separate. So this feature actually was in Rails. It landed in Rails. It got reverted. The reason it got reverted is that there was a discussion about whether this is the right approach or the builder API. And my opinion is that the only way that you would prefer a builder API is if you're not writing that much JSON. And you're happy in your client to hand roll every single client. But we actually are doing a different thing. And what we're doing is we want to have a single client that works with Rails, just like you can have a single adapter that works with ActiveRecord. And what we found was that it was actually very hard for us to build a client that worked with arbitrary Rails applications because everyone was doing this hand-coded stuff everywhere. So there was no way for us to say, just drop this in and it will work. It failed in the beginning for the same reason that Active Resource failed, which is that there's just not enough consistency between how people are actually building JSON APIs in the first place. So what does Ember Rails do? Ember Rails when you generate a model, you get a serializer like I showed before, you get an Ember data model. There's a REST adapter which basically says follow these rules and everything will work. So this is Ember data. There's no reason why in my ideal world we would have a framework agnostic library that came with Rails that knew how to talk the Rails protocol, the Rails conventional protocol. So you will turn on your store, you say, okay, here's my adapter. You make your models. This is literally all the code you have to write. And this particular code would get generated for you when you generated your model in the first place. So you write that code. Then you say, OK, give me all the people. Later on, you will get me the first object. You set the first name. You go commit the store. And basically, Ember will automatically handle doing all the work because it can say, OK, I know what a person is. A person must be /person/ID. Rails will do that. Rails will include any associations alongside. Rails will include a root always that is the same as the thing that you're requesting, right? So we can basically eliminate that. I had a slide with like 10 questions about how to do it. We can basically assume the answers to all those 10 questions because we are basically shipping with active model serializers. Now, serialization is just, I think, one of 3 parts of this bigger story. So serialization is how you actually go about generating the JSON in the first place. There's also how you get the data back. So if you're always doing single requests per object, this is not that hard. Basically, I'm happy to just do whatever scaffolding does. But it's relatively common. You like update 100 items or 1,000 items at once, and you want to make a bulk update for all those 1,000 items. In my opinion, Rails should have an answer for that. And actually, the last time I talked to DHH about this, he agreed that there should be an answer for how to do bulk that is a generic thing. And the last of the 3 pieces is, I think Rails, just like Rails ships with Rails.js for the automated Ajax helpers, I think we should have a thing that says, here is how you talk to Rails from JavaScript. And that should be totally agnostic from anything, any MVC framework, but it should be something that an MVC framework can use to say, if you use Rails, I'm just going to use Rails.js for the persistence part. I'll use that in my library. Like I said before, serializers doesn't actually solve the bulk problem. I think we need to define conventions around it. So Ember data, we just bit the bullet and said, we're just going to define some rules. So our example applications all follow those rules. I think it's still pretty ugly, the amount of work you have to do to make that work. And so I will continue, like I advocated last year for bulk. I think we're finally getting to a point where we can make something happen here. I think Ember data itself has some nice features like an identity map, like binding data automatically to views, like associations. So how exactly, if you create a parent and a child and you try to persist a parent, you don't have the ID yet, how do you know what to do with the child? So we do a lot of work to make this cool. Like I said, for me, That's like a value add that we provide, and I would like that to be built on top of something that backbone users could use just as well, probably with some more manual effort. I think we in general need, and maybe this is something that could happen in Ember Rails and backbone Rails, but I think we need to have better conventions for where you put your JavaScript other than put your JavaScript in the JavaScript's directory. Like we could do that in Ruby. We could say put your Ruby in the lib directory, but we don't. We know that there's a difference. We know that there are different types of things. There's controllers, there's models, right? In JavaScript and MVC frameworks, even in very simple ones, there are also these buckets, there's templates. And I think we should do a better job of saying, okay, assuming you're not doing raw jQuery, if you're doing anything with JavaScript MVC, there's going to be some basic places where you could expect to find your templates, where you could expect to find your models, where you could expect to find any view objects. There's a lot of consistency between how these things actually work in practice, and I think we should think about leveraging that consistency. Again, maybe that starts off as like an Ember Rails and a backbone Rails thing, but I think we could do a better job of telling people what they should be doing without, picking a winner and saying backbone wins or Ember wins. The last part of this section is just, in general, I think for me, the key takeaway is that trivial choices are the enemy. If we're making a lot of trivial choices in Rails, we are doing it wrong. So if you ever find yourself making a lot of choices, which I do when I'm working on rich client-side applications, something is wrong. We need to we need to do a course-correcting operation to fix the problem. And I want to close by just talking a little bit about Node. And people say, okay, you should use Node because it's JavaScript on the client and the server, we don't have to duplicate code, and it's obviously will be easy to interface between these things. And I want to share a quote from Paul Graham. He said, back in 1995, we knew something that I don't think our competitors understood, and few understand even now. When you're writing software that only has to run on your own servers, you can use any language you want. When you're writing desktop software, there's a strong bias towards writing applications in the same language as the operating system. But with web-based software, you can use whatever language you want. This new freedom is a double-edged sword, however. Now that you can use any language, you have to think about which one to use. Companies that try to pretend nothing has changed risk finding that their competitors do not. And I think, to me, this is exactly the same thing happening again. People say, obviously in JavaScript, in the browser, native language is JavaScript. So let's just do the same thing on the server. Why not? And for me, there's basically two ways to deal with communicating between the client and the server. You could have standards and conventions. You could have rules for how you communicate, or you could try to run the same language everywhere. Java said same language everywhere. Everyone else said standards and conventions. I don't think anybody actually uses DRB. And for me, standards and conventions wins every time. We would like to be able to use the best language on the server. And I ask people, maybe there's some people with Stockholm Syndrome who think JavaScript is just the best language, period. I'm not as hateful as a lot of other people. I write a lot of JavaScript. If I hated it, I would be very depressed. But if you don't think JavaScript is the best language, then why not heed Paul Graham's words and use the language that you think is the best language on the server? We can. We have the luxury to use the best language. We don't have to take the unhappy accident that JavaScript ended up being ubiquitous on the client and being the only language and extend that intentionally to the server. Why should I do that? I don't want to. And telling me I have to because it won on the client is basically saying, because it won on the client, now you are forced to use it on the server. And I just don't want to do that. Now, there might be some, if you could show me some good examples of it being an epic win, fine. But I think that the epic wins are going to be of the right-hand side variety, of the JMS variety. And I don't think that that's actually a win in the long term. So to recap, good conventions save developers from having to agonize over common problems. Rails, years ago, made a bet on REST that gave it a leg up on HTTP, which is what we care about when we're building rich client-side applications. But we can do better. We can make APIs as transparent as active record-made databases. There's one approach that we've been working on, which is active model serializers. I would like to get that into core. I think there's a good argument for doing that. And I think we could also make browser frameworks better through the same conventions. I think we could actually, we don't have to say, like Backbone says, the win isn't that you get to make a lot of choices. I think a lot of the frustration that people have with a lot of the client-side frameworks today is that they're saying that is a virtue to make a lot of choices. It's a virtue that they're not being opinionated. And I'm just surprised that Rails people buy that. I think Rails people know better. I think Rails people know that the right answer is good conventions and opinionated answers for trivial decisions. So that's it. Thank you very much.